I was born in the south of Ukraine. The city is called Mykolaiv. It stands on the banks of two rivers, Inhul and Pivdenny Bug, 45 minutes away from the beautiful Black Sea. Today, my city, from day one, is resisting Russian military. It's resisting, surviving, rebuilding, and I have never been more proud of my hometown. It's impressed me, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. But that's not how it all began. In 1984, when I was born, in back then what's called USSR, Ukrainian Social Soviet Republic, one of 15. Being the daughter of a simple working class family, I don't remember camping or road trips with my family. It was a luxury we could not afford. But I do remember being a 5-year-old, laying flowers in front of the portrait of Lenin, a murderer of millions. We spoke Russian, we thought Russian, we were thinking Russian, we drank the poison of Russian propaganda very early on. But that's where my heritage came to rescue. My mother came from Western Ukraine. She was born in 1947, 2 years after the World War II. The country of that large size was struggling, with millions have died, been injured, or living below the poverty line. At the age of 16, she was promised a better life in the south of Ukraine. It was rapidly industrializing, and she had to leave her mom and dad, her brothers, and cross the country from Western Ukraine to South Ukraine, where she got a job to work at the shipbuilding plant. I remember my grandparents, Babusia, Katya, and Dido Ivan. They spoke Ukrainian, they thought Ukrainian. They were Ukrainian every cell of their existence, despite centuries of brutal policy against anything and everyone Ukrainian. And by the way, just like Anton, my grandma taught me a prayer in Ukrainian. They survived by farming, by growing everything they had. They had a big garden, an orchard, and plenty of stock. The trip, in early 80s and 90s, I remember my mom started taking me back to see my grandparents. And it was a 28-hour train ride, a 2-hour by bus, and a 2-hour by foot journey to my grandparents, to my Ukraine. I remember every time we walked through the final stretch of forest and the birds sang, and I was so happy. And then I remember as we approached the gardens, almost always you could see find my grandma in the same spot, in her garden, in her large garden. And I was screaming across the field to her in Russian, "Babushka." And she would see us, immediately break into tears, and welcome us back in Ukrainian. "Diti moi." I was speaking Russian, and I remember all the kids in the village making fun of me for speaking Russian. And that was so strange. But they always loved me. This little girl, this little Russian-speaking girl from a big city in the south was always welcomed in this little Ukrainian village. They made me feel like I belonged there. Visiting my grandma and that village, and the house that my grandparents have built became my happiest space and childhood memory. In 1991, Ukrainian people have voted for Ukraine to be independent. We wanted to have our own path of freedom. We wanted our own life with the right to make our own decisions, our own errors, and face the circumstances of it. The colors of our independence were blue and yellow. In my high school, I remember when in 5th grade we started to study Ukrainian language and culture. My teacher's name was Olga Alexandrovna. She taught my older brother and my sister. I was a third-generation student from the same family for her. It's her who also showed me unlimited love for Ukraine and our heritage and culture. And believe me, Ukrainian literature is super dark and sad. I don't even know how it was allowed, actually, as a children's curriculum, because it's mostly about tragic destiny of Ukrainians and repression by Russian Empire and Soviet Union. We started to study history, and the knowledge of Holodomor appeared. You probably have never heard of it. But that's 1931 to 1933, where under Stalin, millions of Ukrainians were starved to death. For one reason, being Ukrainian, and there's no joking about this. He could not control the culture and heritage, the resistance in the villages, because the villages is where culture survives more than anything, through traditions, through knowing and respecting your history. It was much easier to control cities. Speak Russian. Ukrainian is for peasants. Peasants? So why did Stalin continue killing Ukrainians? Writers, composers. The Ukrainian Catholic Church was banned by Stalin in 1946 and was functioning underground till 1986. Till 1986. It was not just the ban of the language. You were sent to gulags, Stalin's camp in Siberia, or simply killed. And let me just do this experiment. Do you know this melody? It's a Ukrainian author that was killed by KGB eventually. Because the second you became a symbol for Ukrainian people and hope for Ukrainian people, you're a threat to Soviet Union. As I remember the moment when we were coming to see my grandma and my mom would switch to Ukrainian for the first time because she felt safe in that environment to switch to Ukrainian. And very early on, I became aware of the language domain. And then as all this knowledge came in with Ukrainian language, culture, and history, this historical pain of being Ukrainian became a big part of my conscious life. And I was living in Mykolaiv, very Russified due to heavy Russification policy by Soviet Union city, where I was feeling like an outcast. I couldn't say words in Ukrainian in my own hometown, because if you speak in Ukrainian back then in Mykolaiv, people would point at you and think, are you crazy? Can't you speak Russian? The same Lenin, his statue was installed in every village and city across the Soviet Union, across all 15 republics. Not sure if you know, his body is still in Moscow in the Red Square for Russians to worship, a murderer. And so my oasis was going back to my grandparents. My oasis was to study Ukrainian language, to be immersed in Ukrainian culture, our language, dancing, traditions, food. I never felt home in my own hometown. But every time I looked up at that statue of Lenin in the center of my hometown, I imagined the moment, and I asked, will I live to the day where he will no longer be here? In 2007, I moved to the United States. I had no intention moving there, but this was a way to support my family. All of my family is still in Ukraine. And this is when, for the first time, I didn't have to think twice. Can I speak Ukrainian? I took on identity that I have been developing for so long. And with every Ukrainian I've met since then, I speak Ukrainian, because there's no reason to speak forced on us for centuries language. I was avoiding Russian-speaking community of San Francisco, my friends from all over the world, but not Russia. They could not understand the pain of my heritage. And I did not want to blend in anymore. I still feel shame of not overcoming, my discomfort of speaking Ukrainian in my own hometown. But I always wanted to be welcomed in my hometown the way I am. I wanted my Ukraine to exist in my hometown because I did love it. And I wanted to love me back. And then everything changed in 2014. Guys, this was a very clear sign of Russian aggression against Ukraine and what's going to happen with annexation of Crimea after the Revolution of Dignity. You know what is that? It's 100+ people being shot on the main street of Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, because they've chosen to oust the pro-Russian president. They did not want to sign a treaty for Ukraine to join Europe. And Ukraine is Europe, and we want democracy. And we're not part of Russia, and we do not want to go back to Soviet Union. They were killed to exercise their right to be free, to be Ukrainian. Thousands were injured. It's then when so many people switched to Ukrainian from Russian. You know why? Because that became our weapon against Russian evil. It's because the words of our anthem became our prayer. I remember clearly, just at the moments when I was the most scared, playing the anthem of Ukraine. Because if you understand the words of anthem of Ukraine, it's insane. We're living it. All the pain that I learned about for Ukrainian nation, all of a sudden, me, in the real flesh, I was living that. I was a target. My nation was a target in 21st century. After Revolution of Dignity has won and we were able to oust our president who ran to Russia, Ukrainians in the Bay Area, in the US, around the world, we rolled our sleeves and got to work. This is actually when we found Nova Ukraine. Because I remember clearly the moment when we were protesting in front of Russian consulate in San Francisco, that, by the way, no longer exists. And I was saying, if with annexation of Crimea and the start of war in east of Ukraine, we do not stop Putin now, we will be at the brink of World War III later. People thought I'm crazy. Where are we now? What I was doing since I arrived in the United States, I was practicing, and I'm still, very passionate about cultural diplomacy. I beg you not to say the Ukraine. It's incorrect. Ukraine is an independent nation. There's no the France, there's no the Italy. It's Kyiv, not Kyiv. It's Odessa with one S. Borscht is a traditional Ukrainian dish, not Russian. Last summer, after I was doing my first 8,000-meter peak in Pakistan, I got a chance to visit my mom in Mykolaiv. It was the first time where I heard Ukrainian in my hometown, and the first time I spoke Ukrainian in my hometown. I felt like I touched the miracle. I felt like I touched the impossible. I was so happy. 36 later, there was hope. And by the way, by then I already have cried out of happiness when I watched the statue of Lenin fall during the Revolution of Dignity. Many of Lenin's fell across Ukraine. That was a symbol of repression. And by the way, Soviet Union was repressing not just Ukrainians. Many Russians suffered from that. I was so happy. It was just 6 months ago. So 6 months later, I was in Chile with my friends from Kharkiv, and you might have heard this town. It's the second largest city in Ukraine. We're in Atacama Desert, the world's driest desert, attempting our summit of the world's highest volcano, Ojo de Salado. When via the satellite phone, we learned that Ukraine has been bombed. Every major city in Ukraine was bombed by a bullying neighbor. Ukraine, that's bigger than France and Germany. Ukraine, that's 1.5 size times bigger than size of California. Independent Ukraine in 21st century, bombed. And so my 75-year-old mother is back across the country in her parents' house that she had to leave at 16. It's been empty for 20 plus years. She is there waiting for me. Stay strong, Mom. Stay strong, Ukraine. Bravery does not have a color, but if it would be blue and yellow, and it would speak Ukrainian. Thank you.